So what we are going to do in this lesson is create a new React functional component, and our goal will be to emulate all of the functionality of our app component, our class-based app component, into a new React functional component using hooks. So we're literally going to replace all of these features one by one in our new component. So here in my src directory, I'm going to create a new component called app with hooks. And again, that file can have either a JS or a JSX extension. This time around, I'll give it an extension of JSX. And I'm going to drag this file over to the right. And here we have, of course, an empty canvas. So as a quick review, let's define a React functional component. We can use either an arrow function or a traditional JavaScript function. It doesn't really matter. In this case, I'll go with a traditional JavaScript function. So here's the function keyword. I'll call this component app with hooks. And here is my function body. And as a reminder, the only thing we need here is to return some JSX. This is the equivalent of the render method in our class component. So right here, I'm just going to return a literal div with the text some JSX. And before I forget, I'm going to export default this React functional component, so app with hooks. And this is totally valid. Now, there is no way to maintain any kind of state in this component, or at least there wasn't before the invention of hooks, right? The actual name for these types of components back in the old days was stateless functional components, or SFCs. You can see the word stateless was literally present in the name because there was no way to maintain state. If we wanted state, we needed to use a class component with this.state, which is represented right here. This is an alternative syntax, but it's the same idea. It's this.state under the hood, and there was no way to have this functionality in a functional component like this before the invention of hooks. Well, now the useState hook allows us to maintain state in a functional component. I want to emphasize as well that we cannot use hooks in a class component. Hooks are designed specifically for a functional component. So right here at the very top of the file, I'm going to import a named export from the React library, and it is called useState. useState is an example of a hook. It is a function that we can invoke directly in line within our functional components that's going to allow us to hook into existing React functionality. So a feature of React, if you will. In this case, the feature that we're trying to emulate from class components is state management. So here in line, before I return my JSX, I'm going to invoke useState. All right, so right here, what useState expects as its argument is going to be the initial value for that piece of state that you're defining. So right here, our state is an object of 5 properties. But for our implementation in our new component, I'd like for you to think a little bit differently and think of each of these properties as its own different piece of state. We don't have to do it this way, but I think this is the easiest way for us to start out and reason about the useState hook. So in other words, we're going to have a piece of state called login mode, and then email, password, confirm password, and so on. So if, for example, I'm trying to model our first piece of state, which is login mode, the initial starter value here is true, and that's what I'm going to provide to this invocation of useState. It is the starter value for some piece of state that I'm going to maintain over the component's existence. So what useState is going to return to us is an array of 2 elements, okay? This can be a little bit confusing to people, but it is an array of 2 elements. The first element in that array is going to be the current value for that state, what that state currently is. So for example, when this component starts out, we're going to initialize that state to be true, and so the first element in that array is going to be the value true. But keep in mind, whenever that state changes, that thing will update. So for example, if I go here and I declare a const, and we're going to use the destructuring syntax that we saw in the previous lesson. So I'm going to provide my square brackets here. Remember, useState is returning an array of 2 elements, so we can have up to 2 names in here, and each one will be assigned sequentially in line to each of those array's elements. So as I mentioned, the very first thing in the array is the current value of that piece of state. So I'm going to call that login mode. So login mode, when this component starts out, is going to be equal to the value of true, but over time it has the capacity to change because that is exactly what state is. State is data that changes over time, and as it changes, then login mode will similarly change to reflect the most up-to-date value of that piece of state. So that is the first element in the array. The second element in the array is going to be a function that's going to allow us to update that piece of state. So this is the function that we're going to use to update this piece of state that is representing the login mode. So you can almost think of it as this is this.state, and the second function, or the second element in the array, is the equivalent of this.setState. It is the function that is going to update that specific piece of state. And the convention you're going to see in the React community is you're typically going to give the function that you're destructuring here a name of the word set and then the actual state property. So if we're saying this is our login mode, our function to update the login mode will be set login mode. I do want to reiterate that because we are destructuring, these names are totally up to us. We can call them whatever we want, but the idea is the first element is the value as it currently is, and the second value is a function to update that value to the next state, right? So this is like this.state, and this is like this.setState, but for just one piece of state that starts off with a Boolean value, right? So in other words, we can do set login mode to false or set login mode to true. And as we do that, this function is responsible for updating that piece of state, and then this login mode will be the most up-to-date value of that state. In this case, it's a Boolean, but it can be whatever we want, a string, a number, etc. So what I'm going to do is replicate this syntax for all 5 of our state properties on the left-hand side. So the next thing I want to do is our email, right? So once again, I'm going to say useState, and the initial state for that field is going to be an empty string. So here I'm going to do an empty string, and of course, this is going to return an array that I can destructure to have 2 elements. One is going to be the current value for that piece of state. This is our email state, so I'm going to call it email. And the second element is going to be a function to update that given piece of state, in this case, update the email string. So as I mentioned, the typical convention is to use the set word followed by the actual name of the value or the state that is being represented. So what you'd see here in a typical React code base is to call this set email. Again, this is not a technical requirement of React, but it kind of makes logical sense, right? Because you're setting whatever this value is going to be. This is almost, another way I can put this is the reader and this is the writer. This is the getter and this is the setter. This is what it currently is, and this is what you want it to be, right? So let's replicate this syntax for our other 3 properties. So right here, I'll do const, I'll do a array destructuring, I'll say password, and then for the function, I'll call that set password, and that will be a invocation of the useState hook, and I'll pass in the initial value for my password state. That's going to be an empty string, just like above. And same thing for confirm password. So right here, confirm password, then set confirm password. Then we're going to use the useState hook, which returns an array of 2 elements. The argument I provide to useState is the initial starter value for that piece of state. For our confirm password, it's once again going to be a empty string. And then finally, the last state property I have is message. So once again, const message, then set message. Those are going to be the 2 constants I assign to the 2 elements in the array that is returned by useState. useState also needs the starter value for that state, and for our message, it's going to start out as an empty string. So what I've done here using the useState hook is emulate this setup process in our class component. I've now created a React functional component singular that is using the useState hook to define 5 pieces of state, 5 pieces of data that will vary over the component's existence, right? And for all of those invocations, useState returns an array of 2 elements. The first value, or the first element in that array, is the current value of that piece of state. The second element in that array is a function to update that current piece of state, and you can invoke that function as many times as you want. All right, so again, this is like the this.state equivalent, and this is like the this.setState equivalent. All right, and that's where I want to close this lesson off, and hopefully the array destruction syntax makes sense. And with that, in the next lesson, we'll continue chipping away once again replacing our old app component with this new React functional component that's going to emulate all of that functionality. And that will allow you to see how we replace all of these features with the new hooks equivalent. So super exciting stuff, and I will see you in the next lesson.